Okay, low density lifestyle. Yes, doing a video interview, Will Tuttle. Will has been very glad to do an interview with me. I saw him talk recently, and I'll just tell you a little bit about Will. Will's written a book called The World Peace Diet, and yeah, we'll lose you every once in a while. Will is a national recognized writer, educator, pianist, musician, composer, and devoting to providing words and music that inspire insight and compassion. And he's an award-winning author and Dharma master in the Zen meditation tradition. And he has a doctorate from Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and taught college courses also in music, philosophy, mythology, and creativity. Has a lot of good things to say, and I thought it'd be a great guest to talk about a lot of good ideas. So, Will, welcome. Thanks for your willingness to be here. Um,
Great.
and
Good to
and
be.
where are you? Where am I talking to you from?
We're just south of West Palm Beach.
Great.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the last interviews I did a few months ago was actually some friends of mine who lived on a sailboat in Mexico for the last couple of years. I thought that was good. So it was
Right.
good to be where you are. So we could start talking about your book, if that's a good place to start, The World Peace Diet. And I'll allow you. Why don't you just tell us about some of the ideas, the themes, what exactly a world peace diet is.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. It's great to be with you actually on this. And as you say, we're in West Palm Beach. We live in a rolling home. So behind me, you see our fifth wheel trailer, and we're connected up somehow here by a combination of cell phone and Wi-Fi. At a local county park. And so we travel around and give quite a bit, my wife Madeline and I, quite a few lectures on the World Peace Diet, which is a book that advocates a whole foods, organic, plant-based diet, way of eating and way of being. So that's what the World Peace Diet is. It's basically what we would call, I guess, a vegan diet that's whole foods and organic, and with the motivation being our health, but also compassion for animals, sustainability, and creating a culture that respects life. And so the hope, really, for me in writing the book is to raise consciousness about our culture's routine mistreatment of animals for food, and how we can transition and evolve to a more compassionate way of being.
And so, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. And so the foundation of that is essentially questioning all of the stories we've been told by really in many ways, the religion, education, nutrition, our parents, our teachers, this whole way of looking at the world where we are as human beings infinitely superior to the animals, and that they are just here for us to use. And so it's really looking deeply at the mentality that eating diets with lots of animal foods requires. We're killing 75 million animals every day in the United States. So this is not just a little side project we're engaged in. This is a very large-scale kind of a project. I think it's really the defining feature of our culture is this massive growing of grain to feed animals who are confined and then killed, and the whole medical industry, a food industry, and the underlying way of thinking that supports all that, I think, is what's really fascinating to look at. I think it's the greatest adventure we can take, really, in many ways, intellectually, is to understand the repercussions of our food system and of the way that we're interacting with each other and with animals on this planet.
Right, they're also deeply profound and interconnected issues, and most people are. It seems like so hard for them to wrap their mind around all of this, and so they just mindlessly just go to the supermarket, buy their food, and not really understanding where that food comes from.
Right.
and especially the animal foods that are there.
We don't really want to know where they came from.
Yeah.
We'd rather not know, and that's part of the difficulty. Yeah.
Yeah, and so a world peace diet really affects us in from many levels: environmental, health, spiritual. There's just so many different perspectives. So, do you think if most people adopted a vegan diet, then there'd be much more peace and harmony throughout the world?
I do, actually.
Yeah.
I do think so. I've got a few reasons for that, but I think the main thing is that in order to eat animal foods, we must cultivate a certain mentality that's not in our best interest in terms of creating a life of freedom and equality and justice and peace, because we learn to cultivate a way of seeing where we look at certain beings as just things. Mm-hmm. And whenever we do that, whenever we practice that, we get better at it. And whenever we practice, we get good at it. If I practice tennis, I'll get good at tennis. If I practice disconnecting myself from my actions, I'll get good at disconnecting myself from my actions. We just practice. As we practice, instead of seeing a being, we see a thing, a commodity. And so we do that to animals, we begin to do that to humans, we begin to do that to ourselves, we begin to see ourselves actually more and more as a thing that I'm trying to sell on the market, And so it's a mentality of reductionism and of exclusion and of predation and of elitism and privilege, and in many ways of dominating the feminine dimension, because really in animal agriculture it's essentially the female animals that are most violently treated, because they're the ones that bring forth the babies. The babies are stolen. They're forcibly impregnated against their will, and then the babies are stolen again, and then they're killed. So it's really essentially a system of the male dominating the female, and not just the female, but her uterus and her mammary glands and her reproductive cycles. And so I think that one of the things I point out in the World Peace Diet is that this has been going on for about 8,000 or 10,000 years. It started in some cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean, and these cultures began to own certain animals as property: wild sheep, then wild goats, then cows. And I think this really changed that culture, and it took a long time. It was gradual, but the men especially began to look with eyes of seeing all animals as things. Certain animals were property, the other animals were pests that they had to get rid of, and then the status of women was reduced. They became mere breeders that the men saw as just there to give them babies, and then this whole class structure emerged where certain men had much more wealth because they owned more livestock. Livestock were wealth. The whole word for wealth in the old traditions went back to animals. And capital, for example, comes from capita, which means head. And so we had the beginning of a wealthy class emerging. At the beginning of the very first time we had slavery. Actually, in the very first war, the very first word for war is the old Sanskrit word gavya, which means the desire for more cows. And they would so we had these wealthy capitalists, basically, who owned the livestock, would attack another wealthy capitalist, and if they won, they'd get all this wealth, and they would get prisoners who became slaves, and then women would become also concubines to be used to produce more offspring, just like the cows and sheep and goats were treated the same way, and so a very warlike and male-dominating culture emerged, and it spread throughout the whole Eastern Mediterranean into Central Asia, to Europe, northern Europe, and came to this country, and basically it's been spreading. This culture really that sees beings as property, and I think the reason it's so powerful for us is that we're still in that same culture. That culture has evolved to today, and here we are. We're trying to live with peace and freedom and justice and equality, and yet we're eating meals which are at the very deepest level. Eating food is very powerful in our as a way that we connect with nature and our culture. And the mentality of our meals is the opposite of that. It's the mentality of domination and predation and elitism and privilege and all of that. So the main message here is that we will never actually be successful in our quests for evolving to a more sane and sustainable society until we actually address the food, which is the one thing people say, well, I don't want to talk about that. That's what we have to talk about, because that's the elephant in the living room.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And your book really goes, I mean, it's great how you're sketching out a historical basis, a sociological basis for where we are in the conquest mentality, because your book really goes deeply into, all this. It's really well researched. And I know with patients of mine that I talk to about diet, a lot of them are very nervous to talk about diet and don't want to. It pushes so many buttons. And I get on to the subject of meat with a lot of them, and I always hear people say, "Oh yeah, I don't eat red meat anymore, but I guess eat fit lean meat and chicken, fish, but they still eat it at every dinner." And I say, "Well, how about?" I try to take it in baby steps. How about going, some meals vegetarian? But it's just people are so attached to it. I mean, in our country, we look at other countries that, especially in Asia, where the amount of animal protein is so much less than here, but still eating it.
Right. Well, I think the United States is probably eats more animal foods, meat and dairy per capita than probably any country on the planet. We really eat a huge amount of meat and dairy, and I think there's some real actual data that cheese and meat, certain meats especially, when they're digested, create casomorphines, which are actually physically addictive, especially cheese.
Oh.
And so there may be a component of physical addiction, but I think there is for sure. Whether or not there is or not, I guess we'll find out more. But there definitely is some kind of more emotional addiction, or the coming home as a little kid and smelling my mom's pot roast, and that's my mom loves me because she's making my favorite meal. And then later on, if there isn't a pot roast when I come home and my spouse is cooking, and I think, well, gosh, I'm not loved anymore. And these very deep sort of emotional attachments that are almost not logical, really, that can make it difficult for people to change. Plus, people don't want to do anything that's going to rock the boat in their relationships. Very often people will say, well, I'd love to eat a more plant-based diet, but my husband just really wouldn't go along with it, so I guess I'm just going to have to do that. Or my boss, I wouldn't know what to eat when I went out to dinner with the office staff. Or, people want to fit in. We all want to fit in. We want to go along. We want to be like everybody else. We don't want to be different. And so I think that's one of the main problems is it keeps people from looking deeply at the violence and disease and unsustainability, really, of animal-based foods.
Yeah. Now, your own background is very, very rich, very, very, varied is not the right word, just, you really a well-cultured and sophisticated thinker. How did you come to your own conclusions and understanding about, where you stand today on this?
I think it was a combination of having a strong yearning when I was in my early 20s to somehow awaken spiritually. And I remember leaving home and going on a spiritual pilgrimage and trying to get to California and getting as far as the farm in Tennessee, which was a big hippie commune then, and saw these people who were actually not just surviving but thriving on a totally plant-based diet. So my mind could no longer say, well, you'll die of a protein deficiency if you're not eating meat and dairy, because I saw 1,000 people who were thriving, and a lot of them were children, just born and raised on a plant-based diet, and so that really started the ball rolling for me, I think. And it was so neat. I found out years later that my spouse Madeline, who's a visionary artist from Switzerland, I met her years later. She, at the very same month and year, also stopped eating meat.
Oh.
And we met, years later. But it was, I think, very often there's these so-called coincidences happen. But then I also have a strong musical dimension. I love composing music and playing the piano and giving concerts and things. And I think that musicality connects us with the right side of our brain, in a sense, with the part that sees the patterns and maybe isn't so verbally mediated. And so I've always been playing music throughout my life. And then when after the farm, I spent quite a few years in meditation centers. So I really spent a lot of time just meditating. I would say thousands of hours for sure, just sitting, in the full or half lotus position on the floor, sitting in meditation. And what that does is basically it gradually, I think, gives us the ability to see that what I am is not just my thoughts or my body. Because we're basically in a program in our culture that what we are is this body, and this body to be healthy has to eat meat. And so we begin to have thoughts of grasping and using and manipulating others as instruments and all of that. And I think for me, in meditation, there's this possibility for us to free ourselves from this kind of identification with a fundamentally separate self that is in competition with others and that has to get what I want and keep away from, is in a struggle basically with the world. And we realize that what we are is actually infinite consciousness, which is manifesting through a physical vehicle, but it's not, this isn't me. I mean, it's like if I see a footprint in the sand, I don't say, hey Joe, how are you doing? I realize that footprint was made by someone, but that's not them, or we talk about it sometimes, a shadow. If we're in the sunshine and we're casting a shadow, we're not upset with somebody if they step on our shadow. That's just our shadow, it's not us, That's what this is, actually. We're consciousness. We're infinite and eternal, essentially. But we're raised in a culture that's very materialistic, that since we're eating meat, we learn to see ourselves as just meat. We're eating things, we see ourselves as a separate thing. And so that creates enormous conflict in our lives. We try to get emotional and financial, all kinds of security by manipulating others. And animals in the environment, they basically bear the full fury of this. We just use them without caring. We raise in a culture that does that. So for me, I think the meditation in Zen centers and Tibetan Buddhist centers where people were mostly vegetarian helped a lot. And then I began to see the violence in dairy products after about 5 years. So I've actually been a vegan now for a little over 30 years.
Wow, awesome.
Yeah, and I think it was about 1984, I went to Korea, and for the second time in my life, I lived in a community that was vegan. It was a Zen monastery where people had been actually practicing veganism there for 650 years.
Wow. So
I realized this was an ancient tradition among people who were trying to wake up, intellectually and spiritually and morally and so forth. And so I think it was a combination of those influences, plus when I came back to this country after the time in Korea, I got very heavily involved in an intellectual pursuit. I had a master's degree, I got a PhD at Berkeley.
After
and
you
I
came
found
back
that,
from Korea?
Yeah, right. I came back from Korea, and I found that all the meditation, and I think really honestly the years of being a vegan, they really helped to develop intelligence in the sense of a systemic view. All of us, I think, have our intelligence reduced because we're born into a culture that teaches us to disconnect. The basic thing on our plate, whatever it is, we're taught to disconnect from actually how it got on our plate. We just say, oh, this is bacon. We don't see what it really is, the flesh of a tortured animal. We don't want to see that. So we learn to disconnect, and we disconnect. And so I think meditation and veganism are practices of connecting, of being mindful, being conscious, being aware, looking beyond the surface, seeing the bigger picture. And all of that, I think, just increases our intelligence as individuals and increases our intelligence as a culture. So we're born into a culture that is extremely unintelligent right now. This culture is extremely unintelligent. We do incredibly foolish things. We have a technology, we have technological capacities to feed everyone easily. We're growing enough food right now, for example, on the planet to feed between 12 and 15 billion people, we have 1 billion people starving and 1 billion people suffering from diseases of eating massive amounts of grain and legumes that are fed to animals, and then we get, hypertension and diabetes and osteoporosis and arthritis and kidney disease and heart attack and strokes and cancer and all these things that come from that. So this is very unintelligent, or cutting down the rainforest, destroying the oceans, just destroying our planet. This is the manifestation of unintelligence.